Good morning and welcome to the Rawls College of Business Center for Sales and Customer Relationship Excellence webinar, Shifts in the Food Industry Sales and Supply Chain During the COVID-19 Pandemic, featuring Mark Baum of the Food Industry Association. We are using the Q&A function during today's webinar, so please place any questions for our speaker or moderators there. We now welcome Dr. Atul Parvatiyar, Director of the Center for Sales and Customer Relationship Excellence.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody who is logged in from the United States. Good evening to people who are logged in from Asia. I know there are a lot of people from Asia, including India, and good afternoon to people who are logged in from Europe. Welcome to our webinar. And this would be our webinar before the holidays, the final webinar before the holidays. And we have an outstanding speaker today. I'll introduce Mark Baum to you in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. And what better than to talk about food during the holidays? So even though we are in a situation where it's unusual times, but if the holidays are there, and we will talk about food and the changes in the food industry. But before I formally introduce our featured speaker, let me first introduce our Dean, Dean Margaret Williams. She is a great supporter and a champion of all kinds of new initiatives. And I would like to request Dean Margaret Williams. She's a professor of management and the Dean of the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. Dean Margaret Williams, please.
Thank you so much, Atul. Welcome everyone to the Rawls College of Business, even if it is virtually. We're so glad that you have a little bit of time to join us this morning. I think COVID-19 has, among other things, has taught us so much. And one of the things it keeps doing over and over again is exposing our vulnerabilities. So if there were people who were not focused on supply chain, didn't think that supply chain management was an important area for our students to be studying, they certainly feel that way now because we all have been affected by the COVID issues related to the supply chain, and we will continue to be. And so it's wonderful to have you here today, Mark, to speak to this topic. So thank you for sharing your time with us today. I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. I also want to take just a minute to thank Atul and his team for putting on another great event as part of this series. I want to thank Julie Doss, Matthew Winfrey for all the work they do in putting these series on. And I see that Dan Taylor is with us today. So Dan, thank you for your participation as well. I think it's really a great way for us to reach out. So, and I want to thank my friend Hank Doris for being the platinum sponsor. Hank and I have had some very interesting conversations about supply chain issues through the course of this pandemic. So it's great to see you, Hank, and I appreciate you sharing all or a lot of your learnings during the pandemic with me and with the college. It's really important for us to hear your stories. So Atul, welcome again, everybody. Atul, thank you so much for putting this on, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Dean Williams. Greatly appreciate it. And I would like to join you in terms of thanking first the sponsors. This is a part of our Distinguished Speaker Series, sponsored by retired Professor Carlton Whitehead. I want to thank his family for their support for helping us bring in some outstanding speakers. I would also like to thank our platinum sponsor, Mr. Hank Doris. From the very beginning that we started the center about 2 years ago, Mr. Hank Doris has been a great supporter and a great champion for us. He has helped us through the various projects and has always been one of our real champions. And he is an accomplished person in the area of food industry, not directly selling food, but selling all the food related packaging. I would like to invite Mr. Hank Doris to welcome all of us and say a few words. You got to unmute yourself.
Well, thank you, Atul. Thank you, Dean Williams, and thank you, Mark, for coming to speak today. It's been interesting. When Atul and I first met, we were discussing sales, and then discussions moved to supply chain. And little did we know how important supply chain management would be through the pandemic. Food service industry has done a tremendous job supplying Americans with everything from beef to toilet paper. And it sounds really simple, but it gets complicated when we're trying to get these products to the shelves, take care of our customers, make sure everybody gets fed. And it's a really big deal to keep your employees safe at the same time, manage the regulatory environment. You've got county health officials on you, to the federal officials, the state officials, and then CDC guidelines, and it's a constant moving target. And today's discussion is very relevant to what's going on out there. And it'll be fun to listen to what Mr. Baum has to say today. Thank you, Atul.
Thank you very much, Hank. Greatly appreciated. And I'd like to also acknowledge some of our other sponsors at the same time. Dell, Paycom, Reynolds Consumer Products, Crawford Insurance, TTU Public Media, as well as our Market Lubbock, amongst the other organizations that have been our supporters. So with that, let me take this opportunity to first and foremost introduce my co-moderator with me, Dr. Daniel Taylor. Dr. Daniel Taylor teaches supply chain management within marketing and supply chain management area. He and I will together be moderating the discussion with Mr. Mark Baum. And let me introduce Mr. Mark Baum. I could probably say that I've been very fortunate to have a very cordial and friendly relationship with Mr. Mark Baum for almost close to about 15 to 20 years now. He is a very accomplished person. He is currently serves the Chief Collaboration and Commercial Officer of Food Marketing Institute, which is the Food Industry Association. If you do not know about FMI, I can only tell you the member organizations' annual revenues added together is close to about $1 trillion in all commodity value. So it's a large industry association, and Mr. Mark Baum is in a very senior position there, and in his role, he engages retailers, manufacturers, suppliers, and service providers, as well as C-suite executives to further trading partner collaboration. He helps in terms of improving operational efficiency, as well as growth opportunities across all segments of the food retail supply chain. Mr. Mark Baum is known for his intricate knowledge of almost every aspect of the food, beverage, and CPG or consumer product goods and retail industry. He's also recognized as one of the foremost experts in the design, management, and execution of strategic and commercial sales, marketing, and merchandising models across consumer-facing industries. In addition to his role at FMI, Mr. Baum is a managing partner of Market Group, which is an advisory firm specializing in the active outdoors marketplace. Prior to that, he was a partner in the publicly traded CPG retail practice organization called Diamond Management and Technology Consultants, which is now owned by PricewaterhouseCoopers. He was also the executive vice president of the Grocery Manufacturers Association and president of and CEO of Association of Sales and Marketing Companies before he joined FMI. Earlier in his career, Mr. Mark Baum served as vice president sales and marketing for Retail Insights, a division of McLean Hunter Media Progressive Grocer Associates. Also, he has worked on several projects for various organizations, starting from his career at Paragon, a New York-based snack food candy distributor. He's on the board of directors of Key Impact Sales and Systems, a national food service broker in the United States. He's an industry venture partner with 2X Consumer Partners, a private equity firm, and he is involved in as a founding champion of the network of Executive Women, a CPG retail industry organization dedicated to providing career opportunities for women and minorities. Mr. Mark Baum is also director of the board of the Oswego State University, his alma mater. I think his career is a very distinguished career, and without getting into any further details, of course, he is a very active outdoor and sporting recreation person. But without much ado, I would like to invite now Mr. Mark Baum.
Atul, thank you for that overly kind introduction. I almost didn't recognize myself. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who have taken the time to join us for what I think is a really critically, not just interesting, but important discussion to be having today in the context of what's happening throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. But I would like to thank you, Atul. I'd like to thank you, Dean Williams, and I'd like to thank you, Hank, for your support and sponsorship of the university. I am looking forward to sharing a little bit of information with all of you today, and then to have my conversation with Atul and Dan, where we can build on some of my remarks. I don't think I need to say a whole lot more about me. I think Atul said more about me than I can possibly remember. I'll just say that I'm coming up on about 40 years in the food and beverage and fast moving consumer goods industry. And I don't think I've ever been as pleased and proud to be a part of this industry as I am today after all this time. When I think about the way we have shown up and stood up to take care of customers and communities during this very uncertain time, I really swell with pride. Just to kind of round that on me, I spent the vast majority of my career on the front end doing commercial strategy for large cap CPG companies and the like, go-to-market, channel management, brand architecture, classic marketing, and commercial leadership. And then about 7 years ago, I joined FMI after helping to lead the development of their strategic plan. So I've spent the last 7 years or so on what I'll call the other side of the desk. Same industry, working with the same companies that I had been advising for all those years, but with a decidedly different point of view. And let me share that point of view with you. If you go to the next slide, please, Matthew. Let me just tell you a bit about FMI. So we are, as I think was noted earlier, the Food Industry Association. Historically, retail and wholesale based and driven. I like to say our retail members come in 31 delicious flavors like Baskin Robbins. We've got one-store operators in the Pacific Northwest, and we've got Walmart down in Bentonville and Amazon and just about everybody in between. And as Atul said, we represent the vast majority of all commodity volume sold through food stores in the United States, and we do have great representation abroad. We're an advocacy organization. So our job is to represent our members in a variety of ways, both internally to improve business practices and externally with a variety of stakeholders. One thing worth noting is that we made a momentous change about 18, 20 months ago to our bylaws to admit product suppliers as full members of FMI with all the rights and responsibilities as retailers and wholesalers. So we are now a vertically integrated trade organization. And I think that's been so important, not just in terms of the way the industry operates and the inextricable links between trading partners, but particularly in the context of this crisis, this pandemic, our ability to come together, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when it comes to the supply chain and being able to provide products and services to keep families intact, to provide them with the nourishment that they need and to enhance their daily lives. That's really been a blessing. Matthew, if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to spend one more minute on FMI and what we do. So you can sort of wrap up everything that we do, Matt, there you go, in basically three sort of buckets of activities. And that is to either advocate, collaborate, and educate. And we do that in a variety of ways. Hank mentioned earlier the need to interface with government throughout this pandemic. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but we do a lot of public policy and advocacy work at the federal level with lawmakers and regulators, with the executive branch, and particularly over the last 8+ months now during the pandemic at the state level, as a lot of those guidance and directives have been decentralized into state houses and states Department of Health and the like. So that's a big part of what we do. The second sort of pillar within our strategy is food and product safety. I like to say that food and product safety is job number one at FMI because it's the one where literally life and death matters can be at stake. And we've got an extensive portfolio of food safety products and services. So for example, we own SQF, the Safe Quality Food Institute. It's a global food safety certification program. So we literally go in and we certify manufacturing facilities to ensure that they meet with global food safety inspection standards. The third pillar within our sort of strategic plan is industry collaboration. That's kind of at the heart and soul of what I do, which is to really bring trading partners together to focus on two things. And I say two things, although it's so much more, but two things relentlessly. And that is one, on the supply side, to get the most efficiency out of our supply chain as absolutely possible. As I'm sure all of you know, retailing is a highly competitive, very low margin business. So that relentless focus on efficiency is one of the hallmarks of the association. But of course, you'll never save your way to prosperity. So the other side of that coin is to focus on demand. And anything we can do to enhance demand, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk about sales, is the second half of what we do in terms of industry collaboration. We convene the industry leadership to come together to focus on the most pressing issues that are identified and prioritized that require one of two things: either large-scale transformational change or initiatives that require scale. And I'll talk a bit more about that. You can see on the slide there are a number of other things we do. We have a number of delivery platforms. We do a lot of original research. I'm going to share some of that with you today. We have a number of educational events over the course of the year. And of course, like I'm sure everyone else over the last several years, we are using social media and those platforms more and more every day. And I'd say in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, I feel like we've been doing, just like we're doing here today, at least one or two or more webinars or webcasts every week in our effort to educate and disseminate information to all of our stakeholders. So with that said, Matthew, if you would go to the next slide, please. I'd like to talk a little bit about COVID-19, what we've been doing in the context of COVID-19, and then I'm going to pivot into its impact on sales and on the supply chain. If you haven't been there already, take the time to go up to FMI's coronavirus resources page, or I should say pages, because that list of resources is now long. And as Hank said early on, not just the need to understand what government is providing in terms of guidance, but the need to interface with them in order to keep the supply chain open and expandable and flexible has been critically important. So for example, early on in the pandemic, the food service industry, year-on-year sales sort of went off a cliff. I mean, they were down 90% from where they were as everybody was forced to stay inside. And that led to a huge increase in demand at retail, at food stores. And if you think about it, I mean, food retailing, being able to go to the grocery store was like the last vestige of normalcy that consumers were able to enjoy. So we were really testing the supply chain and we needed to expand it. So we started to partner with a number of the broadline food service distributors like Sysco and GFS and US Food Service and others. But in order to get those institutional packs, those institutional pack sizers, not for resale, into retail stores, we needed to get the necessarily waivers from the regulatory body. So we interface with them, FDA, USDA, Hank mentioned CDC. We're working with all of those agencies to provide them with information and input that they need from industry, since we've been deemed as essential, as well as to take what it is that they're providing in guidance and provide that to retailers, wholesalers, and manufacturers so they can be in compliance. And they can also use that as a roadmap in order to be able to chart their course as we navigate through this pandemic. If you go to the next slide for 1 second, Matthew, I'd appreciate it. So there are a couple of things I particularly want to draw your attention to. They say that necessity is the mother of invention, and never has that been more true in the course of sort of the dark sky days we've been operating in. And there are two things that led us to these ad hoc partnerships that I think will actually stand the test of time and become long-term strategic relationships over time. The first is the food industry exchange. I talked about this partnership that we started to develop manually with these broadline distributors. Well, we recognized early on we really needed to expand that. So we partnered with a company that specializes in setting up these platforms. They're based in Memphis. They actually produce one of the largest cotton industry exchanges in the world. And we set one up for the food industry. So on the demand side, we had current retailers and wholesalers who have an insatiable need for product and in some cases services, whether it's labor or distribution facilities or trucks over the road. And on the supply side, it's any manufacturer, it's any distributor, whether it's food service, specialty, or otherwise, who has those resources. And that exchange literally electronically mixes and matches. And so that all we need to do is turn the spigot up full as that demand increases. We do think over time, this will become a utility for the industry's use in a secondary sales platform for suppliers and a secondary discovery platform for retailers and their buyers. So one critically important resource that really was created in the context of all of this directly related to the supply chain. The second is the talent exchange. We had this extraordinary need to hire. You've all read the stories about Amazon and Instacart and Walmart and Kroger and Target, and literally those companies alone are hiring millions of workers in order to meet demand. And that trickles down to literally one-store operators in small marketplaces. So the entire food retailing and wholesaling industry has had a need to hire. While at the same time, you've seen millions laid off, furloughed, unemployment ranks swelled in non-food retail, in food service, in travel and transportation and hospitality. And that led to a unique partnership that we put together with a company called Eightfold. They're an AI-based talent management HR firm, and we put together a talent exchange. So on the demand side there, we loaded in all the jobs that retailers were looking to fill. And on the supply side, we've loaded in all the employees from those companies who are looking for work for the time being. We are up to 750,000 jobs on the demand side of that platform. So those are just two of the resources that we put together domestically to help our members and their trading partners manage through this crisis. One more word on coronavirus resources, Matthew, if you go to the next slide. This is a global pandemic, and it started in Asia, and of course it swept across the globe. We are extremely fortunate in that our members operate in virtually every country around the world, and we've used our board and our executive committee to share learnings across those countries and those continents. So for example, IGA, John Rawls, the chairman and CEO of IGA, is one of our executive committee members, and their Asian operations are actually headquartered in Wuhan, China, which was really the genesis of the coronavirus. And so they've been sharing what they did there. So we were able to take their lessons from both the shutdown in terms of tracking the epidemiology, their ability to open things up, and then see what the impact was going to be on the business for planning purposes. Spar International, Tobias Wassman, another member of our board, they operate in 30, 40 countries around the world. He shared in particular their experiences in Europe, Scandinavia, Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Italy, and in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in South Africa as well. And then Ocado, the pure play online retailer out of the UK, Tim Steiner was kind enough to share their experiences with us as well. We also have a strategic relationship with the consulting firm Oliver Wyman, which is a division of Marsh & McLennan. They've developed an incredibly powerful tool through all this called the Pandemic Navigator, using both the epidemiology as well as their ability to track and trace by country, more recently by state and by county and by zip code, and do some grocery forecasting. You can see the link on the screen there. We'll make sure you get that if you would like to learn more about that. So they're helping both companies as well as state governments, as well as federal agencies as well. And then this last bit, I raise this because it's been really interesting to us. We have established this relationship with the Digital Supply Chain Institute just since the pandemic. They've been around for some time, and they are holding these global virtual supply chain collaboratories over the course of the last 8 months or so. So for those of you who are in supply chain functions, we are sharing not just across countries, but across verticals, across industries, and learning from one another about ways in which we can make these adjustments and keep these supply chains flowing over the course of this period of time. And I think that'll pay dividends after the fact as well. So with that said, Matthew, if you go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about supply chain and sales and the shifts in same. If you think about this move towards contactless, frictionless, automation, robotics, and the like, these factors were at work prior to COVID. So if you think about, self-checkout and the number of lanes devoted to that, the use of apps, the ability to automate back office, distribution centers, we're even talking about autonomous delivery and the like. These investments in these priorities were in place before, but COVID has put a spotlight on them, and it has accelerated the need to get to these priorities exponentially. If you go to the next slide, please, Matthew. We've, from the beginning, been tracking. So I mentioned earlier, FMI produces 2 significant original pieces of research every year. One of them is consumer oriented, and it's called US Grocery Trends. Somewhat ironically, we published those trends in February of this year, and we woke up, at least in the US, to COVID as a major impact in early March. So what we did was, partnering with our research firm Hartman, we've been tracking consumer outlook and consumer behavior, as you can see, over the last 9 months or so. And I want to share just a bit of that with you now. Matthew, if you go to the next slide, please. So here's what consumers are saying about COVID-19 and the restrictions placed on them. And you can track this from mid-March all the way through last month. And it has ebbed and flowed a little bit, but it's been pretty much consistent. Most consumers have been either very or extremely concerned with the impact of COVID on the public health. And that has had a dramatic impact on their behavior, who, where, and how they shop. I'll share a little bit of that with you now. Matthew, next slide, please. So where do consumers shop? If you're like my household, most of us are, over the last number of years, cherry picking more formats more frequently, shopping our primary store, shopping for specialty items at those stores, maybe a little bit online, maybe not. But as you can see, the where of how they've shopped has changed dramatically. The vast majority of shoppers have made that change in where they shop, just south of 80%. More are shopping online. Some are avoiding stores that they used to shop at. And 10% of all consumers are no longer shopping in store at all. And we'll click into that in a bit more detail. So that's the where. Matthew, if you go to the next slide, please. So let's talk about beyond the where. Next slide, please, Matt. How they're shopping. This is really, really interesting. Almost 90% of consumers have made a change in how they shop. So they are shopping less frequently, but they're spending more money. They're spending less time in the stores that they're going to, but they're much more deliberate. So chances are they're making their lists in advance. They're not browsing aisles. They're not doing as many impulse buys, but they're getting in and they're getting out, but they're buying more. But the range of items, so a lot of the impulse items that they were shopping for have reduced over the course of the pandemic. I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of categories. And this is really important. 16% are spending more money online, but that's just a fraction of those who have come online in the first place. So Matthew, if you go to the next slide, let's talk about who. This is really interesting. So the primary shopper pre-pandemic is not necessarily the primary shopper during the pandemic. And there are a variety of reasons for that. It could be one or more household members are compromised, or there are other members in the house who are, and they need to ensure for their safety. It could be that given their work requirements, or given the patch quilt of the way in which education is taking place, someone needs to spend more time with the kids. So the who of who shopping has changed as well. But it's really interesting, as many households, those responsibilities were shared prior to. A quarter of them are now having only one person shop for the household. And interestingly enough, more than 10% are having no one in the household shop. Someone from the outside is doing that shopping for them. Next slide, please, Matthew. So I just thought I would talk a little bit about the here and now, and you can read the quotes on the screen. I'm not going to read them for you, but as we're going into the fourth quarter now, and we're seeing a spike in the number of cases, and we're seeing some shutdowns beginning to occur, there was some concern about another run on those most in-demand items. And I should say, if you go back to the spring, our supply chain was sorely tested. Certainly, there were some significant out of stocks early on, particularly for those most in-demand items. But I was really amazed. We spent a lot of time with retailers and manufacturers talking to one another. Certainly, there have still been some chronic shortages in some select categories, like certain paper goods or cleaning and sanitation supplies. But I was actually amazed at how well, as a supply chain, we were able to reduce SKUs and rationalize assortment to ramp up capacity for those most in-demand items. And as we were asked the question time after time, if you don't see that item on the shelf today, chances are if you come back tomorrow, it'll be there. It may not be your number one brand. So there's been a lot more trial over the last 8 months or so, but by and large, manufacturers have been heroic in their ability to deliver to consumers, and retailers have been just extraordinary in their ability to replenish shelves. And I just have to give sort of a shout out to those frontline workers who are really the heroes in all of this, both those who are working in manufacturing facilities and warehouse facilities, driving trucks over the road, and those that are putting items onto the shelf, and particularly those folks working those front lines at checkout, who, like most of us, don't have the luxury of being able to isolate or work from home. They've shown up day after day, and they've been able to take care of their customers and communities. And I know that there was a concern over the last couple of months with things starting to shut down, whether or not there would be the kind of shortages we saw in the spring. And our answer to that has been absolutely not. There may be a run on certain things, but the supply chain is resilient. The supply chain has been able to replenish itself. And even with holidays coming, we just experienced Thanksgiving. I don't have all the numbers yet, but actually Thanksgiving sales were up this year over last year. And we are looking at an increase in holiday sales over the Christmas holidays of 15 to 20%. So I'm not sure exactly that's going to be distributed evenly, depending on what part of the country you're in. But from a retail standpoint, we think we're going to see a very robust holiday season. And I'll talk a little bit more about 2021 and the outlook for the supply chain and sales in just a minute. Next slide, please, Matthew. So there have been two incredibly profound pivots over the course of the last 8 months when it comes to spending and sales. One is the shift from food service to retail. I'm going to talk about that according to this slide in just a minute. And the other has been the shift from in-store on shelf to online. But as you can see from the slide here, you can, depending on who you ask, over the last 10 or 15 years, food service continued to grow at a clip where they represented about 50 cents of every food dollar was being spent away from home. And you can see what's happened over the course of the last 8 months. They've gone back to certainly maybe early or maybe mid-90s levels of spending away from home. That has not been distributed evenly either. So if you're in the quick serve or fast food segment, you haven't been impacted quite as acutely, because we were doing a lot of carry out and drive through there anyway. It's a limited menu. Consumers continue to frequent fast food. If you're in casual dining or up and down the street, those local operators or fine dining, you have felt that acutely. And even with institutional, you have seen tremendous drop-offs as well, because like say colleges and universities and K through 12, I don't have to tell you all the details, but those feeding patterns have shifted significantly. And that's also put a lot more pressure, not just on food and beverage and retail per se, but on packaging and supplies as well. And that will also have an impact on our outlook for things like sustainability and plastics and the like going forward. We'll probably talk a bit more about that in the Q&A, but all these issues become inextricably linked. But there are definitely implications for food service. We do see, and I've been looking at the numbers. We did see some rise in food service away from home over the summer in the warmer months. We've seen some softening in October. I think we're in for a couple of grim months going forward, particularly with the cold weather and the surge in cases. The outlook for 21 is probably still pretty rough for the first half of the year, and hopefully we'll see the beginning of a more fully recovered sector towards the latter half of the year. But if you talk to some of the researchers, the NPDs and the technomics of the world, they're saying when, getting back to pre-pandemic levels, we're talking probably a few years out. Next slide, if you would please, Matthew. So I talked about two significant pivots. One was the shift from food service to retail. The other, perhaps even more profound, and that is the shift from on-shelf to online. We at FMI have been on a 5-year journey with our partners from Nielsen, trying to understand the more digitally engaged food shopper and dimensionalize the size of the prize and give retailers and their trading partners and service providers the tools and the frameworks and the benchmarks that they need to be successful in this environment. So early on, we created a self-diagnostic tool to measure sort of the current state. This was pre-COVID. And then we identified 8 strategic imperatives that retailers and manufacturers need to address in order to really become fully functional within an omni-channel environment. What I find so interesting about the number you see on the screen is we have done 3 forecasts over the last 4 years about the size of the prize in online shopping. If you go back to our original forecast, it was about $100 billion by 2025. If you would kind of equivalize that into average square footage retail stores, that's about 3,000 plus stores. It doesn't mean they all go away, but it means sort of when the music stops, not everybody's going to have a chair. And it does mean that a lot of those existing brick and mortar stores are going to be reconfigured in significant ways. So in January of this year, we did our last reforecast. We almost doubled that projection to 143 billion by 2025. And that was pre-COVID. And as one of our board members said to me recently, Mark, we've done 8 years of digital volume in the last 8 months. And so you can imagine what that next projection is going to be. And oh, by the way, I think I read a forecast yesterday that said November was the first month that online shopping rose to $80 billion, north of $80 billion. So there's no end in sight for this. Let's click into that just a little bit. Next slide, please, Matthew. The one thing that we've learned for sure is that as an industry, there was definitely some exposure and we were not fully prepared for this. So you can see, just what's happened, 300% increases on already double-digit baselines just in the first few months of this pandemic. And, you could take that headline up there and you can kind of turn it the other way around and say that 75% of retailers were ramping up in a major way their online offering pre-pandemic. And if you go to the next slide, please, Matthew, you can see what's happened since then. And by the way, this is a bit old. This goes back to March, but you can see the exponential increases in online shopping. And what's really important to note about this is that a number of these online shoppers were first-time digital shoppers. So maybe in the past they had no need, or perhaps they're part of that group of the 11% that are not visiting stores at all. But the fact is the genie's out of the bottle, and there's a percentage of them, if you look at the consumer sentiment on post-pandemic behavior, some of them say they'll go back to the way that they used to shop, but the vast majority said that they will be more omni-channel shoppers than ever before. Next slide, if you would, please, Matthew. And what's really important to note here is that in an omni-channel world, next slide, please, Matthew, in an omni-channel world, shoppers who are shopping both in store and online are actually your best shoppers. So that basket is accretive. You're not really cannibalizing. Next slide, please. You're not really cannibalizing your in-store purchases, but you're adding to that basket. And what's also really important about this, thank you, that's perfect. What you're knowing about that shopper, we do have loyalty programs. We are learning more about shoppers, but if you can take their full range of purchases, both online and in store, you can get to the point where you can more personalize that shopping experience for them. And you can personalize the information you're providing them to help inform that decision about what's best for them and their families. And just this last bit on shopping is really critical to see the huge increase in those retailers that were investing. And you can look at the numbers on the right there, anywhere between 70 and 90% are doing something about their online program and their e-com program at this point in time. And I will say this, we're also, part of this is this golden age of experimentation. If you go to the next slide, please, Matthew, is that we're seeing sort of this return to using stores and e-com sites as laboratories. We like to say, the last mile is the most expensive. So from a supply chain standpoint, I think Dean Williams said at the beginning, if we didn't know before the pandemic how important supply chain is, now the supply chain executive is really the quarterback. They are the one who's charged with delivering on the promise that retailer, that food service operator, that provider is making to that customer, to that community. And it's really difficult. The margins are very different in, say, click and collect or curbside pickup than they are in home delivery. Retailers are trying to figure out, do I do it with my own people? Do I do it with a third party? Do I do some combination thereof? We're seeing experimentation with everything from automated delivery to drone delivery to the like. We're seeing a bunch of emerging technologies take place. Often when I'm talking about emerging technology, whether it's artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, automation, the Internet of Things or the like, I'll put them up on the screen and we'll talk about them. And I always say what worries me most about that is not what's on the screen, but what's not. What's next? What's coming? What is it that we don't know about as these advances in technology continue to accelerate? We've seen Moore's law on steroids, and the investment schedule required to understand, to invest in, and understand and implement those technologies is really, really significant. And as retailers, you really need to identify and prioritize those that are most important to you. Unless you're one of the largest players in the marketplace, and you have greater access to and cost of capital, you're economically disadvantaged. So you've got to really decide in what to invest in for the benefit of your business, what aligns with your strategy in order to meet the needs of your marketplace. The one thing, I don't have a crystal ball. I know Atul and Dan are probably going to ask me some hard questions about what does this look like going forward. The only thing I can say is, we've seen a lot of this happen over the last 8 months. And when I think about what's next from a consumer standpoint, I think about the open voice network. I think about turning, if you can see, I'm holding my smartphone here. Once we turn this into my own personal avatar, it's game change. And so as an industry, we're working really, really hard to better understand what that means. And so that as an industry that's both globalizing and localizing at the same time, we have the right standards, technical and otherwise. We have interoperability. We have a common nomenclature and definitions so that we can understand, what we need to do together in order to smooth all of that out, and what then individuals companies can do with their own and prioritize. So with that, I think next slide, Matthew. I think with that, I am going to pause. I am really looking forward to turning this back to you, Atul and Dan, and to the Q&A. And I hope all of you who may have some questions will use the Q&A chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So thanks, and back to you, Atul.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's an outstanding presentation, and you have covered a lot of ground. And I must say that after listening to you, I believe the action is in the food industry. What has happened, how the food industry has had to cope with all this, and the various initiatives that you as a collaborative organization have taken, your resources plus how the industry by itself has acted is really remarkable. With that, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions along with Dan. Dan also has several questions, but one of the pressing question would be to ask this question: which of these are going to be new normal and which of these are temporary activities? So what do we expect? I think going to revert back to where, I was very intrigued by one of the charts where you were showing between the food service business and the grocery business. And you showed a spike going up in terms of grocery buying and a spike down as far as food service, but both of them coming back into their own normal scenario. So what do you see as the future? Is it going to be a new normal? And what's going to be the new normal? And what's going to be temporary? We're going to go back to something.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we've thought a lot about this, and we've seen a variety of different forecasts. I will say, first of all, it's interesting. What we've learned throughout all this is that we really have three disparate supply chains in the food industry ecosystem. So we have our retail supply chain, we have our food service supply chain, and what I'll call our charitable or need to feed supply chain as well. And they've not been interconnected. And so one of the lessons learned, and whatever the new thoughts are going to be about that, is that we're going to need more nexus and more connectivity so that we can get product where it needs to be based on the need in that local environment. If anyone is like me, we're pining to get back out to restaurants. I mean, I don't think anybody sees themselves as not going out to eat again. Some of that is going to be predicated on the confidence that people have in going to those places. So I think until we get the vaccine administered at scale, confidence, if you look at the top 10 places where consumers feel safe or unsafe, restaurants still rank towards the bottom of that list. So I think it's going to be some time before we see some recovery there. But here's the other thing I find so interesting about that, Atul, and whether this is going to be the new normal or not remains to be seen. So for example, I'm going to put a spotlight on one of our retailers, HEB, out of San Antonio, Texas.
We have a new, first time in Lubbock, a new HEB store just very close to my home.
So right in your backyard now. So the hometown crowd with the Texas retailer, they have stood up a number of partnerships with the local restaurants in the markets in which they operate here, creating meals to go so that consumers can enjoy those meals from their favorite restaurants that they can pick up in a very convenient way on their trip to their HEB. They announced recently last month that they are going to stand up a food court partnering with a variety of restaurants, which they think will be very successful in a post-COVID environment. So, the other question is, if it was a zero-sum game pre-COVID, 50 cents of every dollar, right, battling mano a mano for that fair share of that food dollar between retailers and restaurateurs, is it going to go back to that, or are we going to see more partnerships? And I'll just add one other thing to this, in the interest of time. A number of retailers in recent years were sort of fighting back against the loss of share vis-a-vis food service operators, and were putting their own on-premise dining operations into place, more prepared meals, more hot bars, more the like, some more successfully than others. Some have done really well because we've seen some build back and share that was pre-pandemic. And a lot of retailers feel very confident that the equity and the loyalty, it was your opening remarks as we got into Q&A here, Atul, they really are the heroes. They have really, customers are really, really proud of their retailers and see them as their partners and helping them take care of their families. A lot of retailers will try to capitalize that in the post-pandemic world with their on-premise dining. But the truth is, a lot of them may turn to local restaurant operators and put some kiosk retailing partnerships together. So you may see more of that in the post-pandemic world than you saw before as well.
That's very interesting. I think, part of it we see also United Supermarkets having a larger space and footprint in terms of their dining inside the retail store, as well as takeout food. I think Dan has several questions relating to supply chain. Let him ask a few questions, then I want to come back to you
Sure.
on some of the other things. Dan.
Mark, yeah, we've noticed a few things here at the business school. One of the first is our enrollment for supply chain has nearly doubled over the last year. Probably has something to do with the fact that our students are getting hired at a rapid rate currently. But along those lines, it's been widely reported that Amazon will hire approximately a half million employees by the end of this year, which nearly doubles their workforce to 1.2 million. And in reference and scale, Walmart has approximately 2.2 million associates. So as a sort of a two-part question, in our earlier discussions, you talked a little bit about how we are training the customer, and you spoke that customers are becoming trained to shop online. Post-pandemic, what are your thoughts on consumers returning to traditional in-store shopping? And a follow-on question to that is, do you believe that customers can be trained to return to the stores?
Yeah, Dan, I think in one of our previous conversations, I did use the word we've trained customers to shop online. Well, when I say we train customers, we talk about we train customers to buy only on deal in select categories, given, promotional schedules and the like. They just get accustomed to these patterns. And by the way, when I say we train customers, we've made it easier for them to shop online. And as we've improved those e-commerce sites, and the ability to make those offers and to navigate and to provide a combination of products and information, customers definitely find the online shopping experience more enjoyable. But I really appreciate the question, and I'll tell you why. I've had one retailer said to me, one of the retailers that has experienced a triple digit percentage increase in their online shoppers said, you know what, for every item I sell online, it's one less customer I have coming to my store. And why would I specifically want my customer to abandon my most precious asset, which is my brick and mortar store? And food is different. So think about other categories that have gone pure play online. Look, Amazon started as a bookseller, okay? A book is a book is a book. I'm not saying that they can replicate the in-store experience of an independent bookseller, but those are more commoditized items. Food is different. Food and beverage is tactile, it's sensory, it's intimate. You see the colors, you have the smells, you get to touch things. Food is a metaphor for, cultural togetherness or differences. I always say the most powerful, sort of weapon in the State Department arsenal of diplomacy is dinner. I mean, it's, I asked a question rhetorically, how many things you voluntarily put inside your body? Why do we break bread together as business associates? Food is very, very different. And I did go, I've tried to stay home as much as possible, but I went to a new store opening near my house recently. And it was like, I was back to the kaleidoscope. It was like Dorothy landing in Oz and opening the door. It was Technicolor. We miss all that. So I do think you're going to see a return to in-store to a degree. I think the bigger question, Dan, is, what does that in-store experience look like, and what does the online experience look like? There's going to be a great reckoning on assortment at the end of all of this. So as we've rationalized SKUs to expand capacity for those items, we've greatly reduced, did we really need that 11th line extension in household category X? Are we going to see a return to that? I think retailers are going to say, gee, you know what? We could live without all those items. Or manufacturers going to say, the last 8 months has done what the last 8 years hasn't done. It's sort of cleaned out all the dogs. All those Me Too non-value added line extensions are gone. Maybe we should return to real innovation. And as retailers, how should I curate the selection? What goes online? What should be that online experience? And maybe it's those items that are more apt to go to automated replenishment or subscription services. And maybe we make in-store more experiential. We take some of those commoditized items out and we reconfigure what the store looks like and its footprint. Maybe there is no more center store. Or who said, a store had to have a floor, a ceiling, and 4 walls anyway. So I think there's going to be a great reckoning along those lines. But I do think that there is going to be a balancing out of in-store and online. And if you go back to what I said earlier, your omni shopper can be your best and most profitable. You just need to be able to manage it and manage it profitably.
Looks like we're getting some questions in from the audience. There's a couple here that are somewhat related. So let me bring these two up. I'm going to ask two questions that I think are a little bit related to each other. The first is from Funda Sahin. What are your thoughts on distribution network reconfiguration, e.g. Amazon adding more distribution centers? And then Barry Friends speaks, we are witnessing urban
Barry
flight.
Maloney. Barry Friends is
No,
Barry
it's
Maloney.
it's probably Barry Friends. I know them both. This was
Okay.
Barry Friends, I'm sure.
So he mentions we are witnessing urban flight, folks moving to suburbs, smaller cities, and rural addresses, fueled in part by work from home. How will that impact the industry? So we have one network question and one question about how customers are or how the consumer is relocating it.
Yeah, so I guess I'll take them in sequence, Stan. It's probably the easiest thing to do. On the network question, I said earlier, again, I want to reiterate how proud I am to be part of an industry that was able to work through an unprecedented event at scale and still deliver products and services to consumers. But it definitely exposed cracks in the supply chain. There's no question about that. And both within the individual supply chains and this need for these connected supply chains that I talked about earlier. I think you're going to see, and it was a great question because I think this is a lessons learned thing, and we are kind of standing up some strategic partnerships and ad hoc working groups to create these distribution nodes that allow us to repurpose to get to perpetual inventory on those items that are most in demand, which is critically important, and also to be able to pivot from channel to channel to get items where they need to be. I guess I'll use the most stark example because I think it's the one that gets everybody's attention. If you look at charitable feeding or local feeding, food banks, pantries, and the like, we have seen a 60 to 70% increase in the need to feed over the last 8 months. Many of those folks having those requirements for the very first time. We have seen a corresponding decrease in many cases in the number of product donations, just because there's such demand for those items. So, how do you reconcile that? In some cases, Feeding America can't even procure the items that they would like to buy because you got to meet the needs of those local communities first. And, a lot of these items that have gone on allocation are based on historic ordering patterns and the like. So we need to rethink all of those things in order to get product where it needs to be most. And when consumers turn on the television and they see pictures of, fields being plowed under or, spilt milk or whatever it is, it's really easy to go from hero to villain in this industry. So we owe it to ourselves to develop a new model of collaboration in order to create those nodes amongst and between our supply chains. I hope I've answered that question without actually knowing how we're going to do that yet. I think we kind of need a new food deal in order to help make that happen, although we have some ideas about how to do that. The second, Barry's question around this flight from urban areas has huge implications. First of all, in the food service sector, if you look at major metropolitan areas, the urban areas, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and the like, and this breaks my heart. I'm a New Yorker, in case anybody couldn't tell. So it's my hometown, and it breaks my heart every day when I see what's happening there, particularly to the restaurant and hospitality sector, which is really the beating heart of places like New York City. I think that those places are really going to struggle. By the way, the next crisis outside of all this is going to be, commercial and residential real estate. So a lot of folks who have realized, what, I can do this work virtually. And by the way, the cost of living is a lot less in Lubbock than it is in Chicago. So you're going to see a huge influx of folks moving to your part of the world and out of those major metropolitan areas. So it's going to have a direct impact on distribution and on the balance between food service and retail and the like, and on demand. So when I talk about the smoothing out of the supply chain and how sales are going to be forecast going forward, it's going to be uneven. The same way, for example, the pandemic, the epidemiology of the pandemic first hit in, you know, the coastal areas in big cities just because of the density of population. I mean, this was an existential threat if you went to the plains and the Southwest and those areas of the country through almost the summertime. And now those are the places that are in some cases are being completely overwhelmed. So we're going to have to take a very bad, and by the way, this is where that Oliver Wyman pandemic navigator and grocery forecasting tool is becoming so critically important, is understanding that migration and being able to both track the overall health of those communities as well as what's happening within those communities, both from a retail and a food service standpoint, for better business planning going forward.
Mark, there's a question which is there, and that leads me also to a larger question. The question is about PPOD. I think the question which is being asked by somebody, you know, is anonymous there, saying that what about the PPOD business operation? They seem as if they had a good supply chain, but they have decided to stop service in the Midwest. And my larger question, therefore, is, has the pandemic exposed, therefore, which companies can be resilient and which companies cannot be resilient? So is PPOD a victim of its lack of resilience, or is that only a tactical decision?
I think it was a tactical, well, there's two parts of that, Atul, because the latter part is really, it is a zero-sum game in that sense, that companies that are less resilient or less prepared or less able to harness what they need in the context, they're going to be more exposed and they're more likely to feel the impact acutely. In the issue concerning PPOD, first of all, I tip my hat to PPOD. I remember back in the 90s when the founders of the company stood that up. Boy, you want to talk about an idea that was ahead of its time. There, and if you think about in the 90s, PPOD, Webvan, Streamline, there were a bunch of pure play services for both food and beverage and other goods and services. But the the technology wasn't there, the economic model wasn't right, and that's why a lot of them went away. PPOD's lifeline really became Ahold Del, what is now Ahold Delhaize USA. So they are now owned by Ahold Delhaize, and that's a great partnership because they have both the best of both worlds, right? Both the infrastructure, they were well ahead of their ability to do pure play online, as well as combine that with their brick and mortar, and they work very, very well together. I don't know, because I haven't asked the question, what the factors behind the facts are on their decision to pull out of the Midwest, which is ironic because that's where PPOD is headquartered right now, but they're still very strong in the East. And I will add that Ahold Delhaize just 2 weeks ago, maybe bought Fresh Direct, which is one of the strongest pure play providers in the New York metropolitan area and heading down sort of the I-95 corridor. So I don't think they've abandoned online at all. I think, again, as companies are tumbling the numbers and looking at the costs associated with these services, Ahold Delhaize may say, you know, let's reallocate those resources to where we need them most, and maybe they'll use a third party in those markets where they were using their own before as a more cost-effective and efficient vehicle for delivering e-com.
There's another question. Actually, there was a question. Dan also had similar question, but Mateen from India and also Shashibala from India, they are both asking one question that is related to, you know, buy online and shop or pick up at the store. That is, you know, the whole online to offline model. So what do you think, you know, as I remember Dan making a comment earlier saying that this whole, initially almost all the grocery retailers immediately shifted a large part of it to Bob's model, that is buy online and pick up at the store. But that the capacity got kind of exhausted pretty quickly. So is it going to be a norm, or is it going to get back to the old times when, okay, some people will only buy online and pick up at the store, or this is a trend that's going to follow through?
So I think the answer to that is it's going to be a little bit of all of the above. And by the way, there's no one size fits all for either curbside or click and collect or home delivery. There are a lot of different models out there. Even within click and collect, which preceded home delivery in the US. I mean, again, we're fortunate because we get to learn from those who are leading edge. So if you look at click and collect The first models were really initiated in Europe. I think about the maturity of the model in France, where they call it Drive with Auchan and others that really, built it into their operations earlier on. Again, shopping patterns are a little different there. And then we learned from the models they built about how to provide click and collect services here. And then the question becomes, are there fees associated with those? Do you give it away? How do you make the economics work? Retailers, by and large, prefer click and collect to home delivery for a variety of reasons. A, the economics are better. And B, in some cases, if you're not just doing curbside, you're just doing pickup at store, you still may get the opportunity for the in-store experience and the impulse buys, in addition to those items that you bought online, which you lose completely when you do home delivery. And as good as some retailers are getting at their e-com sites, and some are really doing a great job. Again, I go back to, there's just so much you can do in a two-dimensional environment on screen. You can use algorithms to make suggestions. You can help with menu planning for families. You can do promotions. You can do all those things, but there's nothing like the in-store for bringing that to life. Some shoppers, and again, I'll make one other comment about this tool, because I probably should have said this up front. The demographics around online shopping and the shift in the drivers of the path to purchase are fascinating, because frankly, they span all demographics. These are not geographical indicators. They're not indicated exclusively by age, by gender, by race, or by income. Some of these shifts are across all of those demographics, and it's 50% or more who have felt them to one degree or another. I'd be way out over my skis if I were to predict an actual number on what that gets back to, but I think, you're going to see more, we call it omni. So whether it's, on shelf at store, or whether it's home delivery exclusively online or in store, shoppers have those options. And as I mentioned, open voice earlier, wait till voice protocols are established. I mean, that's gonna be the next wave in all of this as well.
Dan, you have a question here.
Oh, yeah, to follow on, I mean, we've been working with a local grocery store here, and we noted much what you state, what Atul brought up, that when the pandemic hit, they hit capacity on all their online offerings, which were delivery, buy online, pickup from store. And over the summer and into the fall, that's dropped around to 85, 90%. So I guess we really don't know what that is. I think maybe something you can also comment to that's not quite on the questions here is there are some regulated products that are sold in stores and that can only be sold in stores, like your wine, your alcohol, these sort of things.
Sure.
Is that gonna provide some sort of stimulus to help keep the customer in the store?
Well, first of all, we could spend like a day on this question, Dan, so I'll try to be succinct. We have about 7 or 8 minutes left. When it comes to those items, so one thing we know for sure, throughout the last 8+ months, consumers are cooking a lot more at home, right? So it's given a new lease on life to, say, meal kit companies. And so that has all sorts of implications, both for home delivery and pickup at stores, a convenience relative to those. The other thing we know for sure is that people are drinking a lot more. Okay. Wine, beer, and spirits. So I kid sometimes when I'm talking with colleagues, consumers are going to come out of this as either much better chefs or raging alcoholics, or maybe a combination of the two. But they're definitely doing a whole lot more of all of those things. And in states, and beer and wine and spirits are a little different. It's a 3-tier distribution system. It's regulated by state. So in some states, you can't buy those, you're limited in the products you can buy at food retailing, or you've got state-controlled liquor stores with beer and wine at retail. And in some states, you can buy beer, wine, and spirits in store. Certainly, that's a magnet to get people back into stores. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I think, again, you have to bundle that up with the rest of the offerings that you're making for that consumer to make that in-store trip palatable. The other thing, and this wasn't part of the question, but I feel compelled to add it, just given what we're talking about here today along the lines of supply chain and sales. There's a whole series of supply chain questions that need to be answered, or things that need to be done to make your e-com site successful. And I mean everything from the product attributes to everything that we say once you move to e-com, digital must equal physical. So when it comes to supply chain attributes between trading partners, whether that's weights and measures, product attributes, order to cash, and the like, we're not really very good. Complete and accurate data is definitely not a hallmark of the CPG retail industry, but I like to say at the end of the day, retailers muscle products onto shelves and eventually manufacturers get paid. It's not pretty, and we have some pretty inelegant workarounds, but we get it done. Consumers won't be so forgiving. If that online experience is not exactly what they expect relative to their in-store experience, you'll be punished by it. So there's an awful lot of work we need to do behind the scenes from a supply chain standpoint to make sure that that experience is exactly what it is that they're looking for.
Mark, I have a question relating to the shelf that you talked about. And a couple of questions that let me combine 2 or 3 things and you can address them together. One is earlier you talked about rationalization of assortment, which means that a lot of these, in the product mix, a lot of these SKUs are going to go away. Also, you talked about, the important aspect of with the COVID coming in, the sales and marketing agencies or the brokers who were doing the continuity sales in the store, managing the shelf and doing all the stock rotation and everything else. They have also faced this problem with the pandemic that not many people are allowed inside the store. And the third aspect is, as you're talking about, more and more shift towards online. With that, the traditional role of the brokers and the food sales and marketing agencies, that gets challenged. So how do you see the evolution of the sales and marketing agencies, that those who did the primary function of not only selling but managing the sell through in the stores? So how is that going to shape up?
Sure. Let me take that in 2 maybe tranches here, Atul. First is on the product assortment itself, and I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I do think that there's going to be a reckoning. So if you looked early on in the pandemic, consumers were hunkering down with comfort and nostalgia. So you saw a lot of center store CPG companies, food and beverage companies that those sales agencies have historically represented, gone from sort of slow to low to no to negative growth to exponential growth. Right, 5 to 15, 20% growth. So that was a real boon for them. And now as consumers are, recognizing they're going to be home for a while, they're becoming much more aspirational from a health and well-being standpoint. So they're going much more back to what they consider, for lack of a better term, healthier options, natural, organic, specialty, artisanal, et cetera. And so those smaller companies have expanded the ranks of suppliers within retailers exponentially. Right? Because there's thousands of those, what we used to call the ankle biters, who are having all the fun, who are adding into the mix and the assortment. So there's a greater opportunity, to represent those companies than ever before as they start expanding their businesses. I think when it comes to the traditional role, most large cap CPG companies have gone to a hybrid role of representation. They're direct at many national accounts, and agency represented at some of the, mid-tier accounts and smaller accounts. And then they're using agencies for retail coverage. Companies have found some very creative ways of continuing to call on customers virtually as opposed to in-store. So the account exec and category manager relationship seems to be working pretty well. It's a little tough from a new product introduction standpoint or promotional schedule standpoint. So, you can mail samples, you can do those things. You can actually, I know some companies have mailed samples directly to consumers with a coupon, encouraging them to come in store and pick those up. So I think agencies are doing their best to preserve those roles. In-store is a completely different story. First of all, with the CDC guidelines and the in-store protocols, retailers are limiting who they're allowing into stores. That's having an impact not just on sales agencies, but DSD as well, and those drivers and those folks who are putting up those products in those sections. There are a number of retailers who are also moving to some of these on-demand or labor arbitrage models, which is also a threat to traditional sales agencies. So we're going to have to rethink labor. And again, we talked about the labor need going forward. We're going to have to think how that's going to look at the back end of all of this. And agencies are going to be right in the middle of that discussion.
Very interesting. then before I ask the last final question, you have anything else to ask, Mark? Because we're almost about done with the time.
I'm looking through the questions we have, and why don't you just move on with your final question?
So I've got one final question to you, Mark, that might address all of it. To say, what have we learned in the crisis management? To this crisis, what is the most important thing you've learned in crisis management?
Well, the one thing we knew, but certainly became very apparent, is the best way to understand how to manage a crisis is not during a crisis. Okay. So we talk about blue sky days. So here's the thing. This is not retailers' first rodeo. Okay. They manage crises all the time. We deal with natural disasters. We deal with hurricane season. We deal with fire. We deal with all of those issues all the time. And we've gotten really good at it. But they tend to be isolated. We've never dealt with a global pandemic. This is a novel zoonotic disease, by the way, which we know won't be the last to come into society. So one of the things we learned is we've got to have all those contingencies in place prior to. So take, for example, this product exchange, the food industry exchange. If we keep that running as a utility for the industry, and all of a sudden that demand ramps up, significantly, and we see a lot of pantry loading or hoarding, whatever it is, we're better equipped to do all of that. So the thing is, we're going to take, and by the way, we're memorializing a lot of this, and we're creating a time capsule, and we're actually putting together a lot of the lessons we've learned that we will apply going forward. So, I'd say that we've learned a lot of things. If we learn one big thing, is that we're better than we thought we were. Okay, we were in a great position to help deliver and take care of families and enrich their lives. And secondly, that we are better together. Every link within the supply chain and every segment within the food industry ecosystem needs to do a better job of coming together and collaborating in order to work better together so that we can leverage all of our collective resources in an effort to take care of our customers.
I'm going to close, but before that, Barry Maloney has a question, only 30 seconds for you. And his question is, through all this COVID, are the manufacturers now going to be wary of outsourcing, or outsourcing in this industry will continue, especially for the manufacturers?
I think a lot of it depends on how they view their own product portfolios going forward. Are we going to see, product portfolios shrink down to just those most essential items, because consumers now, either who never bought them before are buying them, or who bought them before will never be without them ever again? So a lot of it depends on what those product portfolios look like. And I think they're going to see where they get, and I've talked to a lot of outsourced representatives about this. I think there's going to be a need to reinvent themselves in a lot of ways. It's not going to go back to the traditional way. You're going to have to be value added. You're going to have to look for new clients to represent. You're going to have to look at value added services where you can get fee for service or shared revenues or whatever it is. But I think the old sort of way of just being paid a percentage of the business based on a volume that is now taken on a whole new sense of dimension and forecasting, we're not going to go back to the way it was. And when we talk about the new normal, I don't even know how to define what normal is going to look like going forward. It's going to be something very different than what it is today or what it was pre-pandemic, Atul.
Thank you so much, Mark. It has been a fascinating discussion. You have touched upon so many things at a very broad and at the specific level. Really applaud your association as well in terms of bringing in the resources to help the industry. And also, as you rightly said, that we are better than what we thought, which is a pretty important thing, that despite the crisis, the food industry has come along quite well to keep us all, well fed, let me put it this way, and to keep us all happy. And going forward during the Christmas time, hopefully all our favorite food is still available to us and easily available. Of course, there's going to be some rationalization and changes. Absolutely. And as you rightly said, that uncertainties are going to continue, at least for some more time. But the preparedness for uncertainties becomes a very important thing. As you rightly said, having a preparedness for future crisis is an important part of the leadership. So I really want to thank you for this. It has been an outstanding discussion and presentation by you. I also want to thank my co-moderator, Dan Taylor, for stimulating some very interesting questions and being part of this. I want to thank our Dean, Margaret Williams, for her support and for blessing this, as well as our sponsor, particularly our platinum sponsor, Hank Doris, for his continued support and contribution. Guns up. I also want to thank Professor Carlton Whitehead and his family, including Tara Whitehead and others who have been a supporter and contributing towards our center's initiatives. And want to thank, of course, people who have behind the scene or in front of the scene have managed this usefully and been great partners for me personally and helping this. First and foremost, your own colleague and partner, Karen. I want to thank her for she managing a lot of things behind the scene. And
I couldn't do it without her.
So I really want to thank Karen for that. And of course, Julie Doss, who is our Senior Director for External Relationship. And she's, as I would like to call it, my partner in crime, along with Matthew Winfrey for managing all this. And also a couple of other people, if I may quickly mention, our marketing team of April Chavez and Michaela Garrick behind the scene helping us in terms of promoting this. I also want to thank Barry Maloney for sending out the invites yesterday to all the to the agencies. Thank you very much, Barry. And of course, Ryan Todd, who is my development senior director. So thank all of them. Thank you once again, Mark. And we look forward to a continued partnership with you and your colleagues. And hopefully very soon you'll come and see the growth. You're talking about the small town Lubbock. Come and see we are amongst the top 10 fastest growing cities in the country.
I'll look forward to that. Thank you, Atul, and thank you to all of you in Lubbock for all of your help in organizing this and for the invitation. Greatly appreciated. And thanks to all of our participants.
And absolutely thanks all the participants. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.